The sun rose slowly over the small desert town of Red Rock, casting long, golden shadows across the dusty streets. The town seemed almost frozen in time, with wooden buildings lining both sides of the main road and a few wagons parked near the general store. The wind carried the scent of dry earth and sagebrush, and the distant mountains glimmered under the early morning light. For many of the town's residents, life was predictable, quiet, and often lonely. Yet today, something was about to happen that no one could have expected, something that would make the townspeople pause and hold their breath. At the edge of the town, a rider appeared on the horizon. Dust swirled around him as his horse trotted steadily toward the center of Red Rock. The man was tall, with broad shoulders and a rugged face marked by years of sun and wind. His name was James Harper, a cowboy known in nearby towns for his courage, his honesty, and the quiet confidence with which he carried himself. James had been traveling for weeks, moving cattle across the open plains, stopping only when he needed supplies or a brief rest. Today, he had no plan to make a permanent stop. He simply needed to rest his horse and check the local trading post for essentials. As James rode into the town square, the townspeople noticed him immediately. There was something about the way he carried himself that demanded attention. He didn't boast or swagger like some men did. He simply moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the surroundings as if he were aware of every detail. Some townsfolk nodded respectfully, while others whispered among themselves. They could sense that he was a man who would not be easily intimidated or fooled. At the same time, a different figure drew attention from another corner of the square. A woman stood near the edge of the general store, her posture calm but her presence commanding. Her hair was dark, and her eyes shone with a quiet intensity. She was Ayanna, an Apache woman who had traveled from her tribe to trade goods with the town. Ayanna had always been cautious around settlers, knowing that many viewed her with suspicion or fear. She had seen the fear in their eyes and the hesitation in their gestures, but she never let it change who she was. She had a dignity that few could ignore, and a strength that was visible even from a distance. Ayanna had come to Red Rock to trade supplies. Her people had made woven blankets, pottery, and handcrafted tools. She had prepared for this journey carefully, packing her goods with care and traveling only with what was necessary. Her family had taught her the importance of self-respect, honesty, and courage, and she carried those lessons with her wherever she went. Despite the whispers and cautious glances from the townspeople, she held her head high, moving confidently as she arranged her wares near the edge of the general store. James noticed her immediately. There was something about the way she moved, the way she carried herself, that caught his attention. He saw not just her beauty, but also her strength and confidence. Without thinking too much, he guided his horse closer to her, intending to offer help with her wagon, which seemed heavy and difficult to manage alone. As he dismounted, the townspeople watched silently. Some shifted uncomfortably, while others leaned against the wooden posts of the store, curious but cautious. They had learned to respect boundaries and had grown used to keeping their distance from outsiders, especially those who came from tribes that were unfamiliar or feared. They had heard stories of conflict, of misunderstandings, and of townspeople who had acted too boldly and suffered the consequences. Yet today, no one moved. They simply watched, waiting to see what would happen. James approached Ayanna with a friendly smile, tipping his hat slightly as a gesture of respect. "Need a hand with that?" he asked, his voice calm and sincere. It was a simple question, but in Red Rock, such gestures between a settler and a tribal woman were rare. Ayanna looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. There was no fear there, only curiosity and quiet assessment. She studied him for a moment before nodding slightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. "It has been a long journey, and the wagon is heavier than I expected." James moved closer, steadying the wagon as she adjusted the position of the load. Their hands met briefly, a simple touch that would normally go unnoticed in most towns. But here, in Red Rock, it was enough to make the air feel heavier, as if everyone had suddenly become aware of the connection. The town seemed to hold its breath. Horses shifted uneasily, and even the wind seemed to pause for a moment. The townspeople froze, unsure how to react. They had never seen such an interaction before. Some whispered quietly among themselves. "Who is that man?" one asked. "And why is he helping her?" Another murmured. There was a mix of curiosity, admiration, and a hint of fear in their voices. In Red Rock, interactions like this were unusual. There were unwritten rules about who could speak to whom, who could touch whom, and what behaviors were acceptable. Yet here was James, breaking those rules without hesitation, and Ayanna, meeting him with confidence and calm. Despite the attention, neither James nor Ayanna seemed bothered. They focused on the task at hand, carefully adjusting the wagon so it would be easier to move. The moment was quiet but charged with a sense of respect and understanding. James noticed the intricate patterns on the blankets and pottery, recognizing the care and skill that had gone into making them. He admired the work, but he also admired the woman who had created it, or at least had the courage to present it to a town that might not fully accept her. Ayanna, for her part, noticed James's steady hands and calm demeanor. She could see that he was not like other settlers who came through town. He did not approach her with fear, suspicion, or arrogance. Instead, he treated her as an equal, as someone worthy of respect and trust. This simple recognition meant more to her than she could express in words. It was rare to find someone who could see past the walls built by history, prejudice, and fear. The townspeople continued to watch in silence. Some felt uneasy, unsure if the gesture would bring trouble. Others felt a strange sense of hope, as if the boundaries that had divided the town and the surrounding tribes for so long might begin to soften. Children peeked from behind doors, curious about the interaction but sensing the seriousness of the moment. The adults remained still, holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Finally, after a few moments, the wagon was secured, and Ayanna gave a small, appreciative smile. "Thank you," she said again. "That makes a big difference." James nodded, tipping his hat once more. "It's nothing," he replied simply. "We all have to help each other when we can." The simplicity of his words carried weight. It was a reminder that kindness and respect did not need to be complicated. In a town that often relied on fear and distance, this small act of help was remarkable. It was not a grand gesture, not a heroic story of battle or adventure, but something quieter, something human. And in that moment, it was enough to make the entire town pause, to make them reconsider the walls they had built between themselves and others. As James and Ayanna continued their brief conversation, arranging the remaining goods and discussing where she might set up her trade, the town slowly began to breathe again. Some townsfolk shifted their weight, others exchanged glances, but no one interrupted. They had learned, at least for now, that this moment was not theirs to control. It belonged to James and Ayanna, to the courage and respect they had shown each other. By the time James mounted his horse and prepared to continue his journey, the morning sun had climbed higher, illuminating the town in its full light. The dust swirled around the horse's hooves as he rode away, leaving Ayanna to tend to her goods and the townspeople to reflect on what they had witnessed. It was a small, simple interaction, but it had left an impression that would not fade easily. For Ayanna, it was a reminder that respect could be found even in places where she had expected caution or fear. For James, it was a reminder that courage was not always measured by battles won or dangers faced, but by the simple choice to treat someone with dignity and kindness. And for the town of Red Rock, it was a moment that would linger in memory. A story whispered quietly in the weeks and months to come. The town remained unchanged in its structure. The wooden buildings still lining the dusty streets, the mountains still standing watch in the distance. Yet something subtle had shifted. The air carried a sense of possibility, a hint that human connection could overcome fear and prejudice, even in a place that had long relied on silence and caution. And all of it began with a simple gesture, a cowboy reaching out to steady a wagon, and the Apache woman who allowed him to do so. The moment James Harper's hand touched Ayanna's was simple and unassuming, yet it carried a weight far greater than either of them could have anticipated. He had only reached out to steady the wagon, a natural gesture of courtesy and assistance. But in Red Rock, where unspoken boundaries ruled the lives of its residents. This small act was enough to stop the world for a heartbeat. The townspeople froze as though time itself had slowed. Cowboys who had been sauntering through the square paused mid-step, boots half lifted from the dusty ground. Shopkeepers leaned against their counters, their fingers gripping the wooden edges as if the weight of their surprise made it difficult to let go. Even children, who often ran freely through the streets, halted, wide-eyed, clutching the hems of their skirts or the sleeves of their fathers' coats. Every pair of eyes turned toward the two figures at the center of the square, and a heavy, almost sacred silence descended. It was remarkable because no one had seen anything like it before. A cowboy, a man from a neighboring town, reaching out to touch the hand of an Apache woman without hesitation or fear. This was unprecedented. Stories of conflict between settlers and native tribes had long been shared around fireplaces and taverns. Those tales usually carried tension, fear, or caution. But here, in the middle of the town square, there was neither fear nor conflict, only respect. The sight was confusing, almost disorienting, for those who had grown up believing in strict separations and invisible walls between their kind and outsiders. James's eyes met Ayanna's, and in that glance, something unspoken passed between them. It was a quiet acknowledgement, a recognition of courage and dignity. He did not see someone to fear, someone to dominate, or someone to impress. He saw a human being, strong and capable, worthy of the same respect he offered freely to anyone. Ayanna, in turn, did not recoil or step back. She did not shrink into herself or shy away from the gaze of the townspeople. Instead, she met James's eyes calmly, her posture straight, her head held high. She sensed that he was different, that he did not come with the usual suspicion, prejudice, or judgment that many settlers carried in their hearts. The air between them seemed almost electric. It was not a spark of passion, nor a dramatic, sudden emotion, but a quiet, powerful energy born of mutual respect and understanding. It was a simple, human connection. Yet in Red Rock, it carried the weight of generations of mistrust and careful distance. The town, accustomed to watching from afar and keeping order through avoidance and rules, was suddenly confronted with something they could not categorize. Some people felt fear. Others felt awe. A few even felt a flicker of hope, though they did not yet understand why. Ayanna's hands were steady as she continued to adjust the load on her wagon, the blankets shifting slightly under her careful touch. James's hands guided the wagon with equal care, ensuring that it would not tip or fall. They spoke only in soft, polite words, enough to coordinate their efforts. Yet each word was heard clearly by the townspeople. The combination of spoken words, gentle movements, and the silent communication through their eyes created a scene unlike any the town had witnessed. One elderly man, who had lived in Red Rock for decades, whispered to his companion, "I've seen a lot in my time, but I've never seen anything like this." His companion nodded slowly, eyes still fixed on the pair, unsure whether to admire them or to be concerned for the implications of such boldness. The elders remembered the stories of conflicts and the careful lines drawn between communities. And yet, here was a man and a woman, interacting without fear, without hostility, without pretense. It challenged everything they had believed about how the world worked. James noticed the attention but remained calm. He did not flinch or look away. His movements were deliberate, respectful, and measured. He understood the tension his actions had created, but he also understood that retreating would not serve anyone. He was not there to provoke or challenge the town, only to offer help and to honor a human connection where it was deserved. Ayanna, sensing that the town's eyes were on them, also remained composed. She could feel the unspoken judgment, the uncertainty, and even the fear of the onlookers, but she did not allow it to affect her. She had faced far greater challenges in her life, navigating a world that often misunderstood or underestimated her. She had learned patience, courage, and the power of quiet strength. The people of Red Rock would learn something from her presence today, whether they realized it at the moment or later in reflection. As they continued, The crowd began to notice the subtle details of the interaction. The way James handled the wagon with care, not with dominance. The way Ayana's hands were skilled and confident, not hesitant or fearful. The way their eyes met without confusion or aggression, only understanding. These small details slowly shifted the energy in the square. Fear was still present, but it mingled with curiosity and respect. Some of the younger townsfolk, who had only known a rigid, divided community, began to feel a spark of admiration, a realization that the world could be different than they had been taught. It was a long moment, stretched across minutes that felt much longer. The wind picked up slightly, carrying dust and the faint smell of sage. But even the desert seemed to pause, as if observing this unprecedented event. Horses whinnied softly in their pens, almost mirroring the tension in the square. Even the birds that had been chirping and fluttering above stopped for a brief instant, creating a quiet stillness that made every small sound the scrape of a wagon wheel, the soft movement of hands ring loud and clear. Finally, after several minutes, the wagon was properly adjusted, its heavy load secured and ready for trade. Ayana's voice broke the silence, soft yet firm. "Thank you," she said again, with a sincerity that carried through the quiet square. James smiled and tipped his hat. "It's nothing," he replied simply, his voice calm and steady. "We all have to help each other when we can." Those words, though simple, resonated with the people watching. They were not meant as a lesson or a statement, but they carried one anyway. In a town divided by fear, suspicion, and unspoken rules, this small act of kindness and mutual respect was revolutionary. It reminded everyone present that human connection was possible, even when it seemed unlikely. It reminded them that courage could take the form of simple gestures, small acts of empathy, and respect for others. Some of the townspeople, particularly the younger ones, found themselves inspired. They had grown up with stories of conflict and fear, but this moment offered something new. The possibility that people from different worlds could meet as equals, even in a place where history and prejudice had long dictated behavior. Others, older and more cautious, still felt tension, uncertain whether this act would bring trouble or change. But even they could not deny that what they had witnessed was extraordinary. Ayana continued her work, arranging her blankets and pottery neatly, while James offered a few practical suggestions about positioning the wagon and making the trading process easier. Their voices were low, respectful, and purposeful. Even in the midst of the town's attention, they carried on as if the square were empty, a testament to their confidence and self-assurance. Time slowly resumed its pace in Red Rock. The horses relaxed, the children began to move again, and the adults shifted on their feet, still quiet, but less tense. The town had watched something rare, a moment of unguarded humanity, a gesture that transcended long-held boundaries and expectations. And while no one could say exactly what it meant yet, they knew they would not forget it anytime soon. For James and Ayana, the moment was significant but not grandiose. They did not speak of fear or courage explicitly. They simply recognized each other as people, each capable of strength, dignity, and understanding. And in doing so, they created a ripple that would extend far beyond the small square of Red Rock, leaving an imprint on those who had the patience and attentiveness to notice it. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting its bright light over the town, the people of Red Rock began to regain their normal rhythm. Horses were led back to their pens, wagons were secured, and shopkeepers returned behind their counters. Yet an undercurrent of awareness remained. Something had changed, subtly but profoundly. The town had seen that respect and human connection could exist even across the boundaries they had always considered unbreakable. By the time James mounted his horse to continue his journey, he gave Ayana one last nod. She returned it with a slight smile, a quiet acknowledgement of mutual understanding and respect. They parted ways, but the story of that brief, powerful touch lingered in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. It was a moment small in action but monumental in effect, a single gesture that spoke louder than words, louder than tradition, louder than fear. The town of Red Rock, though unchanged in its physical appearance, was different in spirit. A seed had been planted, a subtle possibility that courage and respect could overcome fear and division. And though the people might not yet fully understand what had happened, they would carry the memory of that day with them for years to come. A day when a simple touch between a cowboy and an Apache woman caused the whole town to pause, reflect, and, perhaps unconsciously, begin to rethink their assumptions. After the moment in the town square, life in Red Rock slowly began to resume its usual pace, but something invisible had shifted. The townspeople carried with them the memory of what had happened, a simple touch between James Harper, the cowboy, and Ayanna, the Apache woman that had frozen the entire town in awe and tension. The square had returned to its dusty routine, but whispers and glances lingered. No one had dared approach them during that moment, and even now, the echo of the crowd's frozen silence seemed to hang in the air like an unseen thread connecting everyone. James had continued on his route, leaving behind the square and the quiet crowd, but the impression he had left remained. People could not stop talking about what they had witnessed. In the general store, shopkeepers discussed the scene in hushed tones, careful not to exaggerate, yet struggling to find words for what had unfolded. "Did you see how he touched her hand?" one asked, eyes wide. "And she didn't step back," another replied. "Not even an inch, not afraid at all." The exchange was remarkable, because most townsfolk had grown up believing that any contact between settlers and tribal members should be cautious, limited, or avoided entirely. Yet here was proof that respect could exist, even across those boundaries. Meanwhile, Ayanna remained in Red Rock for a few more days to trade her goods. She continued setting up her blankets, pottery, and handmade tools near the general store. Her movements were calm, deliberate, and practiced, but there was a new awareness around her. People gave her space, watching from a distance, unsure whether to approach or remain silent. She noticed their curiosity, their subtle shifts, but she did not flinch. Years of navigating towns like Red Rock had taught her patience, composure, and the quiet power of presence. She moved with dignity, confident in who she was, and in the knowledge that she had done nothing wrong. James returned occasionally, stopping by the edge of the square or near the trading area to ask if she needed any help. Each time, the townspeople's attention returned to the scene, silently observing the pair. The dynamic between them was simple yet profound. They spoke in calm voices, helping each other with practical matters, adjusting the weight of the wagon, arranging items for trade, or discussing the logistics of her journey. Their hands occasionally brushed, a reminder of the connection that had initially frozen the town. And each time, the same quiet, intense energy filled the air, leaving observers unsure whether to feel admiration, confusion, or unease. Word of the encounter spread quickly, not just in Red Rock but in neighboring areas. Travelers who had passed through Red Rock began to share the story, embellishing little details in the retelling but never changing the essence. A cowboy and an Apache woman had interacted in a way that no one had dared before, and the town had paused to watch. Some praised the courage of both, while others debated what it might mean for the town's safety or the balance with nearby tribes. Older residents remembered past conflicts and feared the possibility of consequences, while younger townsfolk felt a sense of wonder and inspiration. The story began to take root in the minds of people who had witnessed it. In the days that followed, subtle changes began to appear in Red Rock. Shopkeepers were slightly more willing to engage with outsiders, even those from tribes they had previously avoided. Children who had watched from behind doors or skirts began to ask questions about Ayanna and her tribe. Their curiosity mingled with innocence. Parents, while cautious, allowed their children to learn more about people different from themselves. These small shifts were the beginning of something much larger. The slow erosion of fear and prejudice through simple human interaction. James and Ayanna's interactions, though brief, became the center of quiet speculation and reflection. People observed how they treated each other with respect, how they communicated without words, and how their gestures were natural, unforced, and kind. It was not a romantic connection or a dramatic confrontation. It was something quieter, yet far more powerful. A demonstration that courage could exist in humility, that strength could exist in gentleness, and that respect could bridge the divides created by generations of misunderstanding. Some townspeople, particularly those who had experienced hardship or conflict in the past, began to reconsider their own behavior. They realized that they had been holding themselves and others back with unnecessary fear. They had assumed the worst about outsiders, tribespeople, or anyone who did not conform to their immediate understanding of the town's rules. Watching James and Ayanna interact had shown them an alternative, a way to engage with the world openly, honestly, and without prejudice. Ayanna, for her part, also began to notice small changes in Red Rock. Some people, who had avoided eye contact or kept their distance before, now nodded politely or gave a brief smile as they passed. Others lingered quietly, watching her with curiosity rather than suspicion. Though the town remained cautious overall, the seeds of trust had begun to grow. For her, these small gestures were meaningful. They represented acknowledgement, an opening for understanding, and perhaps even the possibility of collaboration and friendship in the future. James observed these shifts as well. He noticed that the town's fear was softening, replaced by curiosity and tentative acceptance. He also understood that his actions were not heroic in a traditional sense. He had not fought a battle, defended the town, or conquered a challenge. His courage was quiet, in offering help without expectation, in treating Ayanna with respect, and in ignoring the unspoken rules of separation that others clung to. Yet, he recognized that these quiet gestures often carried the most profound impact. Over time, the interactions between James and Ayanna became routine, but their significance only grew. Each visit, each conversation, and each gesture reinforced the idea that trust and respect could exist even where fear and suspicion had long dominated. They laughed softly together over shared experiences, discussed the challenges of travel and trade, and exchanged stories from their lives. Their laughter was gentle but infectious, reminding those who watched that joy could exist even in a harsh, unforgiving desert town. Behind closed doors, some town leaders debated the implications of these interactions. They worried that trust with outsiders could lead to conflict or vulnerability. Others argued that such openness could strengthen the community, teaching lessons about empathy, courage, and fairness. Though opinions varied, the story of James and Ayanna had already begun to influence the mindset of Red Rock. People were forced to reconsider assumptions, question long-held prejudices, and reflect on the possibility of change. Meanwhile, Ayanna's presence became a symbol, though quietly so, for the town. She was not a figure of fear, nor was she an object of fascination to be gawked at. She was a person, skilled and confident, capable of navigating the world with dignity. Her connection with James demonstrated that courage, respect, and integrity could exist across cultural boundaries. And as the townspeople slowly recognized this, the subtle tensions that had defined daily life began to ease. Children in the town, always observant, started to emulate the interactions they had witnessed. They asked questions about fairness, kindness, and courage. They learned that it was possible to treat others with respect, even if they came from a different background or community. Parents, noticing these conversations, encouraged curiosity, guiding their children to understand the importance of empathy and courage. In small, quiet ways, the future of Red Rock was beginning to shift, shaped by lessons learned from a simple act of human connection. James and Ayanna never claimed credit for these changes. They acted naturally, with honesty and integrity, unaware of the ripple effect they were creating. They were focused on the moment, on the work at hand, and on the simple act of treating each other as equals. Yet their actions spoke louder than any speech or command could have. By showing respect and courage, they taught the town lessons that would last far longer than their brief visits. As days turned into weeks, the story of that first touch, the frozen square, and the quiet bravery of two people from different worlds became a quiet legend in Red Rock. It was told over meals, in whispers along dusty streets, and in reflections at the end of long days. People remembered it not because it was dramatic or dangerous, but because it was deeply human. It was a story of respect, understanding, and the courage to act with integrity, even when others might not. For Ayanna, The experience strengthened her belief in the possibility of connection. She understood that trust could grow slowly but meaningfully, that courage could manifest in kindness, and that respect could challenge even long-held fear. For James, the story reinforced his understanding that true bravery often lay in the simplest acts, in treating others with dignity and in standing by one's values, no matter how unconventional or surprising they might appear. By the time James rode out of Red Rock for the final time, and Ayanna prepared to continue her trade journey, the town had quietly changed. People spoke less in whispers of fear and more in conversations of possibility. They had learned that actions, even small ones, could reshape perceptions, challenge assumptions, and plant the seeds of trust and respect. The legend of that frozen moment, and the courage and dignity displayed by a cowboy and an Apache woman, would remain in Red Rock's collective memory for years. It was a story that reminded everyone that human connection, respect, and understanding could transcend boundaries, fears, and expectations. It was a lesson quietly carved into the fabric of daily life, a gentle but powerful shift toward empathy and courage that would continue to influence the town long after the dust had settled. As the days turned into weeks, Red Rock began to feel subtly different. Though the change was almost invisible at first, the sun still rose over the dusty streets, casting long shadows across the wooden buildings, and the mountains still stood watch over the town. Yet beneath the familiar rhythms of daily life, the townspeople carried something new. A quiet awareness. A sense that the world could be broader, kinder, and more open than they had always believed. Ayanna continued her trade in the town, her presence now accepted without the same tension that had accompanied her arrival. People gave her space, but they also began to observe her with curiosity rather than fear. Children, always attentive to new sights, watched her carefully, asking their parents questions about her blankets, pottery, and tools. These questions were answered patiently, sometimes in hesitant tones, but they were answered nonetheless. The townspeople began to notice that respect, patience, and understanding were not only possible, but also rewarding. James Harper returned occasionally during this time, stopping to check on Ayanna and offer help when needed. Each visit was quiet, practical, and respectful. He helped adjust heavy loads, offered suggestions for improving her trade setup, and sometimes simply spoke with her about life on the plains, sharing small stories of his travels. Each time he arrived, a subtle shift occurred in the town. People watched, but they no longer froze in fear or uncertainty. They had seen how trust and respect could exist, and they began to absorb it quietly, learning without being taught directly. The bond between James and Ayanna, though simple, was powerful. It was not a romantic tale, but rather a story of mutual understanding and recognition. They learned from each other in small ways. James admired her skill, patience, and intelligence, while Ayanna appreciated his calmness, honesty, and steady courage. Their interactions became a model, showing the town that fear could be replaced by trust and that courage could be quiet and gentle. As more days passed, the townspeople began to change subtly in their behavior. Shopkeepers who had once avoided Ayanna now spoke politely, offering assistance or engaging in small conversation. Farmers and cowboys who had lingered on the edges of the square grew bolder, asking questions about her tribe or the skills required to create her goods. Even the children, who had first observed with wide-eyed curiosity, now began to approach with polite inquiries, learning that kindness could exist in unexpected places. Ayanna noticed these changes with quiet satisfaction. She had long understood the power of patience, and she knew that meaningful change often took time. She continued to work diligently, presenting her goods with care and interacting respectfully with those around her. She never forced connection, never demanded attention, and never reacted to the occasional whispers or hesitant glances with anger. Instead, she allowed her presence, her actions, and her calm dignity to speak for her. James, too, noticed the transformation. He recognized that the small acts he and Ayanna had performed, simple gestures of help, kindness, and respect, were creating ripples that spread through the town. People were beginning to question their assumptions, reconsider their prejudices, and recognize the value of connection. He understood that true courage was not always about grand gestures or heroic feats. Often, it was about consistency, integrity, and the quiet willingness to act rightly in small ways. The older townspeople, who had initially felt fear or skepticism, slowly began to soften. They remembered the frozen moment in the square, the way James and Ayanna had interacted without fear, and they began to see the lesson hidden in that simple gesture. Respect and understanding, they realized, could lead to a stronger, safer, and more connected community. Fear and prejudice, by contrast, only created distance and tension. Over time, they allowed themselves to interact more openly, to speak politely to outsiders, and to consider perspectives they had previously dismissed. In the evenings, the town square began to feel different as well. The once quiet and cautious space started to hum with quiet energy. Traders and travelers moved through with greater ease. Conversations that had been tense or avoided now took place calmly and respectfully. People noticed each other's efforts, small or large, to engage fairly and kindly. The lessons from James and Ayanna's interaction were subtle but persistent, weaving themselves into the fabric of daily life. Even the children carried these lessons forward. They began to approach strangers with curiosity and politeness, learning from example rather than instruction. They asked questions, listened attentively, and respected the answers they received. These small interactions, multiplied across many children and many days, created a foundation for a future generation that would be more open-minded, empathetic, and courageous. For James and Ayanna, their time in Red Rock became a series of small, meaningful moments. Each interaction reinforced the quiet power of human connection. They laughed softly over shared stories, exchanged practical advice about travel and trade, and occasionally simply sat in companionable silence, aware of the subtle lessons being absorbed by the town around them. Their actions spoke more loudly than any words could, demonstrating that courage, respect, and kindness could overcome fear and prejudice without confrontation or force. The story of their initial encounter, the moment that had frozen the town, remained a quiet legend. People told it in hushed tones at first, as if sharing a secret too extraordinary to speak aloud. Over time, it became a symbol of the change possible in Red Rock, a reminder that small acts of humanity could ripple outward and reshape communities. The legend emphasized courage, but not in a dramatic or violent sense. It emphasized quiet bravery, dignity, and the simple, profound impact of treating others as equals. As James prepared to leave Red Rock for the final time, he felt a sense of satisfaction and quiet pride. His journey had been long, his travels demanding, but the connections he had made here, especially the one with Ayanna, were enduring. He knew that his presence had sparked a shift in the town, planting seeds of respect and understanding that would grow slowly but surely. He gave Ayanna a respectful nod, and she returned it with a small, genuine smile. Neither needed more than that. The bond had already said what words could not. Ayanna, in turn, prepared to continue her travels to other towns and trading posts. She carried her goods carefully, but she also carried the knowledge that even a small, courageous act could influence an entire community. She understood that respect and courage were not fleeting moments but enduring choices, and that the trust built through simple gestures could last far beyond any immediate interaction. The townspeople watched as James rode away, their eyes following him until the dust of the road swallowed him from view. They had been witnesses to something remarkable, and though they might not fully understand it, they felt its influence. Conversations that had once been quiet and cautious now carried hints of openness. Interactions that had been tense and hesitant now had room for respect and curiosity. The town of Red Rock had not changed overnight, but it had begun a transformation. One that would continue quietly and steadily in the days, months, and years to come. Even after Ayanna departed, her impact remained. Traders, travelers, and townspeople spoke of her presence with respect. They remembered how she had interacted calmly, confidently, and kindly with the cowboy who had offered help. They remembered how the entire town had frozen for a moment, witnessing a simple yet profound demonstration of human dignity. And in remembering, they learned lessons they had never been formally taught, lessons of courage, empathy, respect, and the quiet power of human connection. Red Rock itself became a different place. Not in appearance but in spirit. The dusty streets remained, the wooden buildings stood tall, and the mountains still watched over the town. But within the hearts and minds of the townspeople, a shift had occurred. They had learned that fear and prejudice could be softened, that curiosity could replace suspicion, and that even a simple act of kindness could leave a lasting mark on a community. The story of James Harper and Ayanna became more than a legend. It became a lesson, passed quietly from person to person. It was a reminder that courage could take many forms, that respect could transcend boundaries, and that the human spirit was capable of kindness even in places where fear had long ruled. Children would grow up hearing the story. Adults would reflect on it in their quiet moments, and the town itself would carry forward the subtle changes, inspired by a simple, profound interaction. And so, as the sun set over Red Rock, casting golden light over the dusty streets and the distant mountains, the town held a quiet sense of possibility. The memory of that single touch between a cowboy and an Apache woman had frozen the town once, but it had also opened hearts, shifted perspectives, and left behind a legacy of understanding. In the years to come, Red Rock would continue to grow, learn, and change, shaped in small but lasting ways by the courage, respect, and dignity of two people who simply chose to see each other as equals. The lesson endured. Sometimes the most extraordinary courage is found not in battle or fame, but in the simple choice to act with kindness, to reach out without fear, and to honor the humanity of another person. James Harper and Ayanna had shown Red Rock that lesson, and in doing so, they had changed not just a moment, but the spirit of an entire town.